Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, the point I'd make to the Prime Minister is this isn't just a matter for the Eurozone, but for other European economies, because it goes to trust in the banking system. And I think it should have been obvious to everyone that a sudden levy imposed on ordinary savers would undermine basic trust and confidence in banks. Could he, from the dispatch box, send a clear message that any negotiated bailout that is going to be subsequently agreed with the government of Cyprus needs to rebuild trust in the banking system and not undermine it further?
We've made our views very clear to the Cypriot government. In our view, is when you have a deposit protection scheme, as we have in this country, as all of Europe put in place after the crash of Lehman Brothers, those deposit protection schemes should be respected. That is the whole point. That is why they're there for small savers.
Harriet Baldwin.
The Civil Service Union has chosen today to go on strike, but the country does not seem to have ground to a halt. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that that probably indicates that there is a bit more room to save in terms of public sector spending so that we can clear up Labour's debts and get this country back on track?
Well, I think my honourable friend raises an important point. It is important to recognise that we should do everything we can to save and find efficiencies in public spending in order to help hard-working families and keep their tax bills down. And that is exactly what this government will continue to do.
Dame Joan Ruddock.
Mr. Speaker, on January 9th, the Prime Minister told me there would be no hospital reorganisations unless there was the support of the local GP commissioners, proper public engagement and an evidence base. Will he now admit that not one of those tests is met in the case of Lewisham Hospital, where he proposes to close down half the services and sell off 2/3 of the land to bail out a neighbouring, failing trust? Mr. Speaker, can anyone trust this Prime Minister on the NHS ever again?
I have to say to the honourable lady that it is worth remembering who set up this PFI deal that has meant that this action has had to be taken. The apology over what is happening at the South London Healthcare Trust should come from the party opposite, because they were responsible for creating this situation. As she knows, £1 million a week is being lost from frontline care. No change is not an option, but under the Health Secretary's plans, he has made sure that Lewisham will retain an A&E with senior medical emergency cover.
Gordon Birtwistle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the FT is just under 6,500. In 2008, it was just under 3,500. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the real investors in this economy agree with the coalition government's economic policy, contrary to the policies delivered by the party opposite?
Well, my honourable friend makes a good point. It is a very difficult and hard road that we're travelling to turn this economy round after the huge mess that was made by the party opposite. But when we look at the fact that just this morning we can see an extra 131,000 people in work, we are seeing the changes necessary to start the rebuilding of our economy.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, last weekend the Foreign Secretary said there was a strong case for lifting or amending the arms embargo on Syria in the months ahead. Given that no decision was taken at the EU Council, does it remain the Prime Minister's intention to seek a relaxation of the EU arms embargo?
First of all, let us look at what we've already achieved in terms of amending the arms embargo, where we specifically asked for it to be changed so that we could give technical support to the opposition. We've achieved that, but the French President and I discussed at the European Council looking for further changes to the arms embargo that will be discussed by foreign affairs ministers this weekend. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, it sends a peculiar message that the arms embargo still applies pretty much equally to this hateful regime and to the opposition, who we now recognise as a legitimate representative of the Syrian people. And second, the French President is concerned, and I am concerned, that we should not be restricted for months and months ahead when we don't know exactly what could happen in Syria, including the very worrying reports of use of chemical weapons.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer, and obviously everybody is appalled by the actions of the Assad regime. But he will know that there is not only a lack of unity among Syrian opposition groups, but there is also the known presence of the al-Qaeda-backed terrorist organisation al-Nusra on the ground in Syria. So does the Prime Minister understand the widespread concern that remains about the idea of seeking to supply weapons to the rebels?
I think the Leader of the Opposition puts the point absolutely rightly. There is widespread concern about the nature of the opposition, and the argument I think we have to engage in is this: are we more likely to help the good elements of the opposition by standing back, or are we more likely to help by getting in there and shaping and helping and giving this technical assistance so that we can actually play a part in building up the Syrian opposition so they are a legitimate and credible alternative to this hateful regime? And it is worth recalling, and we should all recall, the fact that current policies are not working for the people of Syria. 70,000 people are dead and this hateful regime is still in place.
Ed Miliband.
He's absolutely right that the current situation is a terrible situation. We just mustn't make it worse with the actions we take, Mr. Speaker. Now, the UN has said, the spokesman for the UN Secretary-General has said that the introduction of more weapons into Syria is, and I quote, counterproductive and will not lead to a solution. Now, Special Representative Brahimi recently called for a renewed diplomatic initiative to bring the warring parties to the negotiating table. Can the Prime Minister set out what steps the UK government specifically is taking to support the UN in advancing this initiative?
Well, we are taking specific steps to help the UN with this vital initiative, and trying to achieve a diplomatic solution with transition at the top of this regime is worthwhile pursuing, and that is why we've had detailed talks with the Russian foreign and defence ministers in the last week. But I would just make one other point about the issue of the arms embargo, because I felt, sitting around the European Council chamber, there was a slight similarity between some of the arguments that were being made about not putting more weapons into Syria that seemed to me very familiar to the discussions we had about Bosnia and the appalling events that followed. And in my view, it is better to be engaged, working with the Syrian opposition and trying to bring this conflict to an end.
Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Traveller numbers on the coastal railway line running through my constituency of Newton Abbot are growing fast. Given its importance to local tourism in Dawlish and Teignmouth, can the Prime Minister assure me urgent investment plans are in hand to repair recent flood damage and to create a long-term sustainable future for this railway line?
I can give my honourable friend that assurance, and I know that the Transport Secretary will shortly be visiting her constituency. Investment is going into the whole of the line that serves her constituency, including the major investment shortly to be completed at Reading Station, which will help capacity all down the line.
Margaret Ritchie.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be aware of the growing disquiet across the UK regarding his government's welfare reform proposals. Great disquiet because these proposals are deeply unfair and will, I predict, lead to administrative chaos. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that in terms of legacy for him, welfare reform will be his poll tax?
I don't agree with the Honourable Lady at all. I find that there is strong support for the housing benefit cap, so we no longer fund homes in the capital of our country up to £100,000 a year. There is strong support for the welfare cap, and indeed there is strong support for universal credit, which will make sure that in every case people are better off in work and are better off when they choose to work extra hours. That is what we want, is a welfare system that supports enterprise, work and aspiration.
Mr. Henry Bellingham.
Is the Prime Minister aware that 7 people have died on Norfolk's roads in the last week? And furthermore, 8 have died on the A47 in the last 10 weeks. Does he share my concern about this tragic loss of life? And is he aware of a campaign that's being run by myself and other honourable colleagues like the Honourable Member for Broadland to improve the A47? Norfolk people understand the current budgetary constraints, but simply want a fairer share of resources.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for bringing me up to date with this important campaign that he and others are leading in Norfolk. We do have a much better record on road safety than we've had in recent years, but we should never be complacent. We should continue to work on that. I know that money has been made available for road schemes in Norfolk, of course, the A11 chief amongst them. And I can see from the Transport Minister nodding vigorously behind my honourable friend, there may be more to come.
Kathy Jameson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with Lord Heseltine that people are suffering under the recession? and that it would be the wrong politics at this time to remove the 50p top rate of tax? And will he now cancel next month's tax cut for millionaires?
The point I would make to the honourable lady is after the start of the financial year, the top rate of tax will be higher than in any year when Labour was in office. And I'm sure that's something that Michael Heseltine would fully agree with.
Mr. David Mowat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the 20th anniversary of the Warrington bombing. The Prime Minister may recall, or will recall, that over 20 were killed and injured, amongst them a 12-year-old boy, Tim Parry. Will he join me in congratulating Tim's parents, Wendy and Colin, for the way they have worked tirelessly for peace over the last 2 decades, in particular the establishment of the Foundation for Peace, which brings help to victims of conflict around the world?
I certainly join my honourable friend in praising that family for the incredible bravery that they have shown. When you suffer a tragedy like this, it must be so much easier to try to put it behind you and forget about it, but to go on and campaign for peace and to bring together the people of Warrington as they've done, I think shows enormous character and fortitude, and they have the backing of the whole country.
Jonathan Ashworth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Prime Minister had time to consider the remarks of his leader of the MEPs in the European Parliament, who has said of the decision to cut the 50p rate that it was, and I quote, one of the biggest mistakes we've made so far in this Parliament, and disastrous to do so in a recession? Is Mr. Callanan right or wrong?
Well, the point I'd make to the honourable gentleman is that when his party put the top rate of tax up, millionaires paid £7 billion less in taxation. So we're having a lower tax rate that will raise more revenue. That makes pretty good sense.
Paul Uppal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few weeks back, my right honourable friend became the first serving British Prime Minister to visit Amritsar in Punjab. As a British Sikh, can I actually say how warmly this visit was received? But more importantly, would my right honourable friend congratulate Her Majesty's government on the pioneering work they've done in searching the Sikh turban at European airports? This actually shows you can actually have a proactive relationship with Europe rather than a reactive one.
Can I thank my honourable friend for all the work he does in this area and for the way that he consistently raises issues about the British Sikh community, the immense contribution they make to our country and the respect that we should show them. Can I also thank him for accompanying me on that trip to the Golden Temple, something I will never forget, and it is an opportunity to say on behalf of everyone in this House how much British Sikhs give to Britain and how much we thank them for it.
Chion Wura.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Jordan Kingsland, found himself homeless, aged just 17. He was offered social housing and is now studying for his A-levels, determined to improve his situation through education. From his £56 weekly benefit, he will lose £14 in the bedroom tax and £3 in council tax, leaving just £11 per week to live on after utilities. So based on the Prime Minister's experience of hardship, what advice does he have for Jordan?
Well, the point I would make to the honourable lady is, first of all, this government is investing in social housing, and she'll hear more about that in a moment or two. The second point I would make is that when housing benefit costs £23 billion a year, we simply have to reform it. And there is a basic issue of fairness, which is why should someone who's living in private rented accommodation not receive a spare room subsidy when someone who is in social housing should? There is a basic issue of fairness, and that is why it should be put right.